I was asked by Bill to speak this morning about American Buddhism engagement in the public square. I think as a way to reflect on the history of American Buddhism and how far we've come as a community in the nearly 150-year history of the tradition in America. I wanted to start today with this map that depicts the transmission of Buddhism from India throughout the rest of Asia, with a quote by one of the early Buddhist leaders in the United States, Bishop Uchida Koyu, who served as the head of the Buddhist Mission of North America from 1905 to 1923. Reflecting on an even earlier period, he stated that his lineage of Buddhism was the first to, quote, start an American mission which in itself exemplifies the history of an eastward transmission of the Buddhist teachings, Bukkyo Tozen. The Japanese term Bukkyo Tozen, or the eastward movement of Buddhism, was first used in the 8th century Nihon Shoki, or the Chronicle of Japan, to describe how the Buddha's teachings originated in India, but spread through China and Korea to Japan, just as Shakyamuni purportedly prophesied that the Dharma would inevitably be propagated eastward. In the early 20th century, though, Bishop Uchida further extended this notion of the inevitable spread of Buddhism eastward by referring to American Buddhism as the manifestation of the Dharma in regions even further east, such as Hawaii and California. And today, as we assemble for this historic gathering in Washington, D.C., perhaps we too are a part of something that has developed over time. My point is not about some kind of Buddhist triumphalism, but rather that it's worth our while to reflect on history, to locate ourselves temporarily and spatially on the big question of how Buddhism fits into or provides an alternate view about what America is. As someone who grew up in Japan and immigrated to the United States when I was 17, I've always found it kind of curious to hear so many Americans refer to this part of the United States, the East Coast, as back east, or how American history is often so described as a movement that, like go west, young man, like always going west, where pioneers trailblazed their way ever westward. The Anglican bishop, philosopher, and poet, the British George Berkeley, after whom the city of Berkeley, California, and its university is named, exemplifies this notion of America as a nation that begins in Europe, or more specifically in England, and extends to New England and onwards west. As a proponent of sending Christian missionaries to civilize the New World, Berkeley wrote a poem titled America in 1752, a portion of which reads, "Not such as Europe bred in her decay, such as she breeds when fresh and young. Westward the course of empire takes its way. The first 4 acts already past, a 5th shall close the drama with the day. Time's noblest offspring is the last." In this vision of America, the story of the nation is one of bringing civilization that has decayed in the old country into a new world that would be guided by a Christian America. But for the first Buddhists in the Americas, and here we see some early temples from the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Hawaii and California, the movement of both people through migration and civilization through the transmission of Buddhism and other Asian worldviews, for them, the story of America is one of ever eastward settlement and movement. And just as another example, for Latinos, their story of America is one of northward migration and movement. So the first point I wanted to make this morning is by understanding history, the history of American Buddhism, I think we might be able to open our minds to the fact that America is made from multiple regions, of peoples from multiple regions of the world, made of civilizational flows that cannot be reduced to a singular narrative of Christian triumphalism. A fact that was recognized by the nation's founding fathers in their vision of religious freedom, but often forgotten by many, even today, who assert that, quote unquote, America is a Christian nation. Fortunately, the current president, perhaps because of his upbringing in Hawaii and places outside of the United States, famously asserted in his major address on religion in 2006, "Whatever we once were, we are no longer just a Christian nation. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, a Buddhist nation," I love this, a Buddhist nation, a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers. But the ideology of America as a Christian nation, as can be seen in some of the quotes on this slide, was certainly a dominant one that the early Buddhist pioneers faced in Hawaii, a territory forcibly turned from an independent kingdom run by native Hawaiians to one dominated initially by Christian missionaries, then by sugar plantation businessmen and the white-dominated Hawaii territorial government. For example, when Buddhist couples arrived at the wharfs of Honolulu Harbor in the late 1880s, the government mandated that before the immigrants would be admitted, they would need to undergo Christian marriages. In 1905, the first issue of the Hawaii Hochi, one of the earliest and largest Japanese community newspapers, editorialized that such forced Christianization surely violated the American principles of religious freedom and infringed upon the rights of Buddhist and Shinto Japanese migrants. The Buddhist leadership worked together to pressure Washington, D.C., and after a few years, managed to have the federal government order the Hawaii territorial government to stop this practice. I believe this might have been the first example of a successful Buddhist advocacy initiative with the American government. As can be seen, did it not go for it? Sorry, there was a lot of quotes here. And there is a quote here by Bishop Imamura Emyo. And you can see from this quote that Buddhists also stood up to the assumption that to be American, one had to assimilate and convert to Christianity. Indeed, Imamura was well known for his 1919 publication titled Buddhism and American Democracy, in which he not only asserted that Buddhism and the principles of freedom and democracy were not at odds, but that Buddhists could bring a worthy perspective and a set of values to the table, that Buddhism could be a positive addition to the American religious landscape. These claims of a Buddhist and American identity, an American Buddhist as a non-contradiction, would be made by our community's pioneers in an era when not just radical nativists or narrow-minded Christian ministers claimed the impossibility of an American being a Buddhist, but government officials such as Senator Phelan of California, or U.S. intelligence agencies such as the Office of Naval Intelligence viewed Buddhists as a threat to national security. The concrete consequences of these type of views resulted in laws that excluded such so-called Asian heathens from immigration, prohibited Asians from owning land through various state anti-alien land laws, and from naturalization as citizens. That showcased how the legislative branch of government, including Supreme Court, viewed Asians as forever foreign, through their race and religion, unlike the millions of European immigrants who are afforded the ability to become American. And sometimes it would just be local ordinances rather than federal or state law that reminded early American Buddhists that certain neighborhoods would not be welcoming them, as can be seen in this slide from Hollywood, California, of a homeowner hoisting a sign, "Japs keep moving." Or in Seattle, where Buddhist temples, such as the Seattle Buddhist Temple or the Tacoma Buddhist Temple, were unable to register as religious organizations with the local government unless they complied with arbitrary laws that demanded the majority of the temple board be racially white. In one of the most visible displays of how Buddhists engaged the public square that would assume their un-Americanness was their involvement in the labor disputes in the three major strikes on Hawaii's sugar plantations. The Japanese and later a coalition of Japanese Filipino workers, collectively in the tens of thousands, would go on strike in 1904, 09, and 1920 to demand better living conditions, removal of vicious overseers, or other policies seen as unfair, such as the racially based wage structures or the preferential treatment for Christian converts. Since the first Buddhist temples were built on Hawaii's sugar plantations, and these temples had a history of supporting both the material and spiritual lives of these immigrants, the Buddhist priests from a wide range of lineages took a leadership role in advocating for the strikers, providing them refuge at the temple when they were fired for daring to protest, or organizing mass rallies such as that seen in this, on the bottom right side. I don't know if you can see it. There's a large portrait of Abraham Lincoln that the Tozen Buddhist mission contributed, inscribed with the words, "We believe in Lincoln's ideas," leading a march of 3,000 strikers through the streets of Honolulu. All this to say, the image of Buddhists as passive or apathetic to social and political engagement is belied by Buddhist leadership at the helm of one of the major labor struggles in America during the pre-war decades. Another example of early Buddhist participation in the public square was the issue of Japanese language schools in Hawaii and California. The community set up these to supplement the public education system with the study of Japanese language, culture, and religion, so that the immigrant parents and their children could communicate and appreciate a non-majority religious life. But in Hawaii, the territorial legislature, led by Albert Judd, the grandson of an early Christian missionary to the islands, proposed restrictions on these Japanese language schools, housed primarily at Buddhist temples, to safeguard, quote, "for the nation a Christian American citizenship in the territory," unquote. In a first, the Buddhists filed a lawsuit that on February 21, 1927, resulted in the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in the Farrington versus Tokushiga case in favor of the Buddhists and against the Hawaii Territorial Governor Farrington in regards the territory's bans on these schools. And with this first U.S. Supreme Court decision involving American Buddhists, Buddhists won on the basis of the constitutional principle of the free exercise of both speech and religion. But the notion that Buddhism was un-American, if not anti-American, would rear its ugly head again in the days after Pearl Harbor. In the days and even hours after the attack, the FBI arrested hundreds of Buddhist priests, but not Japanese Christian ministers, based on the so-called ABC list that had been compiled in the late 1930s, consisting of those deemed by the intelligence community as high-level threats to national security, to be detained in case of war. Based on pre-war Office of Naval Intelligence reports that claimed that Buddhists would be likely to be more disloyal than Christians in case of war with Japan, the arrests and targeting of Buddhists for confinement in high-security camps intensified until the following spring, when nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans of all faiths and ages were rounded up on the West Coast for confinement in lower security but still remote and isolated concentration camps. Buddhist temples during this period came under attack with shootings and firebombings of temples, especially those that had the Buddhist symbol, like this one here, of the manji, or the swastika, displayed at their entrance. Or, as in the other slide in the bottom, in the case of the San Diego Buddhist Temple main hall that this slide shows, had their Buddhist altars vandalized by those who identified Buddhism with the Axis enemies of war. Yet once in camp, Buddhist families such as the Terasawas, who you see on the right-hand side here, the daughter here can be seen in their new home in an abandoned horse stall at the Portland Assembly Center that they try to make livable. And you can see the American flag and a poster of the Buddha. And they asserted that they could be both loyal Americans while also maintaining their Buddhist faith. Given that those forcibly removed to camp could only take what they could carry in one suitcase, Buddhists in the concentration camps continued to assert their identities as both Buddhist and Americans by literally making do with what was available to them. The Buddhist ojuzu, or prayer beads you see on the left here, was made by a Soto Zen priest who kept and strung together the peach pits of a single piece of fruit he was rationed per week during his time in one of the high security camps. And unable to bring Buddhist statues or altars to camp in the Heart Mountain, Wyoming concentration camp, the other image on this slide, a beautiful altar was crafted from desert wood and pieces of wooden crates left at the mess hall. And yet in another camp, for the Buddha's birthday, typically celebrated in the Japanese style by a ritual of pouring sweet tea over the statue of a baby Buddha, the detainees skillfully carved a Buddha statue out of the largest carrot they could find in the mess hall, and used the sea-ration coffee grinds and saved rations of sugar to make sweet coffee to use in the ritual. In these camps, the many types of creative ways of keeping Buddhism alive in the most difficult of days was best symbolized by the recycling of paper and other wrapping materials and vegetable crates shipped to the mess halls to make beautiful paper flowers that would be used anytime a Buddhist funeral or memorial service took place. In the dry, remote desert conditions where flowers wouldn't naturally be available, it was still important to Buddhists to respectfully honor those who had passed. Among them were those who had passed while serving their country in combat. Of one of the many ironies of the period, thousands upon thousands of young American Buddhists, many from inside the concentration camps, volunteered to serve in Europe in the segregated 100th Battalion or the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, dubbed by the media as the Purple Heart Battalion, as the most decorated unit of its size, not only in World War II, but in all of U.S. Army history. The photos you see in this slide are funerals held behind barbed wire for these young men, the vast majority of whom were Buddhist. The irony lay not only in the fact that they were fighting for American ideals of freedom and democracy, but doing so with their lives sometimes to earn a place for the community in the fabric of American life, while their families were unconstitutionally imprisoned in concentration camps. Indeed, towards the end of the war, this unit was one of the first to liberate a sub-camp of the notorious Nazi death camp at Dachau. The shocked Jewish and political prisoners could not believe their eyes when their liberators were short American soldiers of Japanese descent. And as noted before, despite attempts to shut them down, the majority Buddhist graduates of the Japanese language schools proved essential to the U.S. war effort in the Pacific. The 6,000 who served in the Military Intelligence Service, MIS, by translating captured documents, interrogating Japanese prisoners, intercepting radio communications, breaking military codes, according to General MacArthur's office, were said to have shortened the Pacific War by 2 years and saved tens of thousands of American lives. The efforts of these young Buddhists to claim belonging in America brought about reforms in the U.S. military, such as the assignment of the first Buddhist chaplain to the chaplain corps, the introduction of the letter B for Buddhist on the dog tag, which had hitherto only had the options of P for Protestant, C for Catholic, H for Hebrew, and X for other. And also the use of the Dharma wheel at national cemeteries, such as at Punch Bowl in Hawaii, for the tombstones of Buddhist soldiers who had served in the U.S. military, who had previously been designated by default with Christian crosses on their tombstones. It is on the shoulders of these pioneer American Buddhists that we stand today. Their engagement with American law that even set a U.S. Supreme Court precedent, their involvement in racial equality and labor struggles, and their sacrifices in times of war has made it possible for our community to be much more easily a part of the American fabric of life. Whether it's the construction of the largest Buddhist compound in the U.S. with Shilai Temple in California, the draw of roughly 40,000 people to the annual Lantern Floating Festival on Memorial Day in Honolulu, organized by the Shinyo Buddhist Order, or right here in Washington, D.C., with the election of Buddhists such as Senator Mazie Hirono, Democrat from Hawaii, or Congressman Hank Johnson, Democrat from Georgia. We should recall the efforts, with all of this, of our ancestors and reflect on how far we have come since the days when our community was viewed with either derision as a heathen religion or suspicion as a foreign or even enemy religion. To conclude my presentation this morning, I'd like to end with one final story. It's a story of Masumi Kimura, who in 1941, at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, was an 11-year-old girl. Like everyone else in her small Japanese-American farming community in California's Central Valley, she felt uneasy about what was happening around her. She could see that her immigrant parents, who had settled in Madera, California, were unusually tense and afraid. They had reason to be concerned. The dear friend and president of the Madera Buddhist temple, Mr. Nikaido, had recently been taken away by the FBI. Local white boys had taken their shotguns to the nearby Fresno Buddhist temple and used the front door of their building for target practice. But it was mid-afternoon one day, a few days after Pearl Harbor, when the FBI came to Masumi Kimura's farmhouse door to question her father, a leader in the local Buddhist temple. The FBI agents had barged in and wrestled him to the floor, and when Masumi came upon that scene, she also found that one of the agents was holding a gun to her mother's head. A frightened 11-year-old, she still understood that her English was best in the family, and she calmed herself down to translate into Japanese what the FBI agents were saying. After some further questioning, the agents left for that day, and they said they would return a few days later. In response to this, Masumi's father decided to take steps to prove the family's loyalty to America. He instructed his daughter to start a fire in the furnace next to their Japanese-style bathtub. And since it was Masumi's daily chore to do this, she didn't think much of the request, that is, until her father entered the room carrying every single article in the house that had Japanese language or "Made in Japan" written on it. Tears rolled down Masumi's cheek as her father brought out her precious Hinamatsuri dolls, a special Japanese set given to her on Girls' Day to throw into the fire with all the other Japanese artifacts. Her father explained that anything that could link them to Japan had to be destroyed. It was their only way to prove their loyalty to America. However, her dad hesitated on a few items. He could not bear to throw into that fire minutes of, because he was on the board of his temple, the minutes from the establishment of the temple of the board. He couldn't throw in there his family's bound edition of the Amida Kyo, or the Buddhist scripture. He went outside and dug a hole and placed all of these scriptures and temple records into a tin box and buried them for the duration of the war. And like everyone else, that family had to go to camp, had to sell their farm for 1/20th of the market value, losing everything they had worked so hard for. And after the war, because the new owners had tore down the garage where he had kind of used to kind of mark where he was going to bury that box, that family was never able to recover those Buddhist sutras nor the records of the establishment of a Buddhist temple in California's Central Valley. So even today, Buddhist teachings and history is lost to the soil of California. But surely the lesson we can take from this is to learn from history, to learn from our community ancestors who in their various, sometimes even small ways, persistently asserted that it is possible to be both a Buddhist and an American. And while they may be willing to erase or burn away their national origins, they would not be willing to erase their faith. I hope that our gathering today at the White House will celebrate how far our community has come since then, but to also honor all of those who have come before us. Thank you.